These are the worst foods for cognitive health.
Worst foods for my brain.
But before we get to that, I think it's important for people to feel empowered that with the food choices that they make, they actually can improve their brain health. There's been a number of studies over the past few decades really indicating that with our choices, we can make a meaningful impact in the way that our brains work. And of course, I've written a number of books about this topic. But when it comes to the foods that you want to avoid, I think it's important to be mindful of what refined grain products are and to do your best to minimize your consumption of those foods. Part of the problem with refined grain products, aside from the fact that they're hyperpalatable, meaning we know that they are designed by food manufacturers to usually elicit a sort of overconsumption, hyperphagic response, meaning we don't tire of eating them, right? They have very high glycemic indexes, which is generally not a problem in the context of a meal. But a robust meta-analysis was published in 2019 in the journal Nutrients that found that among people who were metabolically healthy, the consumption of high glycemic foods was robustly associated with risk for developing type 2 diabetes. Now, how does this relate to brain health? We know that when you're a type 2 diabetic, your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease increases anywhere between 2 and 4-fold. So at least a doubling of risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, which is an incurable progressive condition, right? With no meaningful FDA-approved treatment, I might add, if you are a type 2 diabetic. And we see that these kinds of foods, refined grain products, which now typify the standard American diet, are associated with the development of type 2 diabetes, right? Which then is setting you down the road of brain problems potentially down the line. Mm-hmm. So you want to avoid those. Most grain products in the standard American diet are wheat flour based. If they are gluten-free, they could potentially be rice flour based, which comes with its own set of problems because we know that rice flour, particularly brown rice flour, harbors arsenic, which is a toxic heavy metal.
Can I ask a quick question? When you say refined, what does that mean? Refined, like a refined grain versus an unrefined grain?
Yeah. So the majority of grains consumed in the US today are refined grain products. Even whole wheat bread is a highly refined
And does
product.
Refined mean processed or?
It essentially does.
Okay.
Yeah. Although, to just add a little nuance, we process food when we cook food, right? So when you cook a piece of fish, for example, you are processing that food. When you blend up a few berries to make a smoothie, you're processing those berries, right? When you make any recipe, you're essentially you're processing to some degree food, right? There's a distinction in the literature between processed food and ultra processed food. So ultra processed food is food that's essentially made in the lab, made in a factory, made in a plant. We want to eat plants. We don't want to eat foods that are made in plants.
Yeah.
And unfortunately now 60% of the calories that we consume every day come from these ultra processed foods, which are minimally satiating. They're highly calorie dense. They tend to have high glycemic indexes and glycemic loads. So there's a distinction there. Glycemic index indicates the rate at which a food will spike your blood sugar, with glucose being 100, right? Mm-hmm. And glycemic load being the overall amount of glucose that a food is going to put into your blood, right? Is going to digest and then infuse into your system. And those are the kinds of foods that we're now eating. We're now eating in terms of the majority, right? The majority of our calories come from those kinds of foods.
Way too common.
Yeah, way too common. Again, they're calorie dense. They're minimally satiating. They're usually designed to be hyperpalatable, so it's difficult to moderate our consumption of those foods. Ultra processed foods our consumption of ultra processed foods is associated with early mortality. There was another study. I am forgetting the journal off the top of my head, but for every 10% increase in ultra processed food consumption, there was a 14% increased risk of early mortality. And it's because these kinds of foods they're the kinds of foods that underlie essentially the obesity epidemic. They underlie the epidemic of metabolic illness, right? Today, many people have type 2 diabetes. At least half of the US population, adult population, has either diabetes or prediabetes, type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. And 9 in 10 adults have some kind of, some component of metabolic syndrome, whether it's an oversized waistline, an apple shaped body, which we know is associated with inflammation and cardiovascular disease, or lipid dysregulation. So it's a huge problem. And we know that ultra processed foods are sort of at the foundation of that problem. And refined grain products really are, I think, one of the major suspects today. So, there are all kinds of ultra processed food products. There are ultra processed meat products. There are ultra processed oils, right? Grain and seed oils like canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil. These are ultra processed oils. But the grain products in particular, we want to be mindful of the glycemic index and the glycemic load of a food. Now, that doesn't mean that a high glycemic food is going to be the smoking gun. At the end of the day, it's about no single food is going to cause or prevent Alzheimer's disease, right? So if you occasionally have an indulgence meal or snack and it's a high glycemic food, don't worry about it. But again, it's day in and day out. These are the kinds of foods that we're consuming primarily as part of the standard American diet.
So is it, of these refined grains, is it the high glycemic load that is bad for our cognitive health, or like what about the refined grains is specifically bad for my cognitive health?
It's the fact that they tend to be minimally satiating.
Okay.
Oftentimes they're stripped of fiber, so they're minimally satiating. We don't tire of eating them. They often have added sugar, which we're going to talk about, but they often have added sugar. They are nutrient bereft, so they contribute to the fact that today 90% of adults have some type of nutrient deficiency, whether it's vitamin or mineral. And so they contribute in all those different ways, and they're highly calorie dense.
Okay.
Highly calorie dense, minimally satiating, nutrient poor. Big problems.
Bad for my brain.
Yeah.
Okay. What else do you got?
Yeah. Well, I touched on added sugar.
Yeah.
I think added sugar is a big problem. Today, your average adult consumes 77 grams of added sugar every day. Just to visualize that, I mean, that's almost 20 teaspoons of pure sugar every day. Just like close your eyes and try to visualize how much sugar that is. The equivalent of just like opening up a sugar packet and just like pouring it straight into your mouth, right?
Yeah.
Is a sugar packet a teaspoon? I'm not actually sure, but imagine like pouring 20 of those straight into your mouth.
I don't know, but it doesn't sound great.
No, we don't tire of consuming added sugar. We have no satiety checkpoints that register our consumption of added sugar. There's no biological need for added sugar consumption. It's a very high glycemic index. To give you a sense of where it is on the glycemic spectrum. So as I mentioned, glucose has a glycemic index of 100, right? And so every food or ingredient is sort of like ranked along that scale. And table sugar is actually not glucose. So table sugar is actually sucrose, and it's about 50% glucose, 50% fructose. And fructose doesn't have a glycemic index because it's not glucose. And so it actually has a lower glycemic index than pure glucose, but it's very sucrose, right?
Okay.
But it's very rare that somebody consumes pure glucose. Like what we consume typically is some combination of glucose and fructose. Mostly it's sucrose because sucrose is table sugar. And again, added sugar is just empty calories. It's a big problem. It affects your hormones negatively. We've talked about in the past the fact that one single high sugar beverage in clinical research has been shown to increase blood pressure, which high blood pressure is directly related to worse brain health. You want to make sure to protect your cardiovascular health. Your brain is fed blood and nutrients and oxygen and fuel essentially by this network of microvessels that if you were to take out of your head and stack end to end, that would stretch 400 miles long. And it's these like very delicate microvessels that we need to protect. And when you have high blood pressure and chronically high blood sugar, you're basically damaging that vasculature. And dysfunction of that vasculature and the blood-brain barrier that basically that is sort of associated with those microvessels is at the etiology of Alzheimer's disease, and even prior to Alzheimer's disease, worse memory function. So you definitely want to do your best to minimize your consumption of added sugar. Again, a little bit here and there is not going to be a problem, but we tend to overconsume it, and added sugar tends to be at the sort of foundation of the epidemic of metabolic disease and obesity. Just because, again, we don't tire of consuming it. It is it's empty calories and it's nutrient poor.
Okay, so refined grains, added sugar.
Yeah. The next thing that I would add, oh, and also I think we should talk about where you find added sugar.
Okay.
Yeah, so added sugar tends to be in all the ultra processed foods that we mentioned, but it's also, I mean, some of the top sources in the standard American diet are like coffee drinks, low fat or fat free dairy products tend to have a lot of added sugar. Refined grain products tend to add added sugar as well. Sauces are a big source these days, and sugar sweetened beverages, of course, whether it's fruit juice or soft drinks, and then candy, confectionery products. It's all over the place.
Can I ask a sugar question? When it says like coconut, you mentioned table sugar is a combo of fructose and glucose,
Yeah.
but like sugars like coconut sugar, what is that? Do you know?
Each sugar is a little bit different.
It's different?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. I was just
Yeah.
curious because we always talk about how sugar is sugar.
Yeah, like agave nectar, for example, is
Yeah.
mostly it's like upwards of 80% fructose.
Fructose. Okay.
Yeah,
So it is.
it's primarily fructose. So it actually deceivingly has a low glycemic index, but that doesn't like abdicate it from the problems that added sugar is associated with.
Right.
Just because it has a low glycemic index. So you just want to be mindful of added sugar in all of its many forms.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. The next item that you want to avoid for cognitive health are grain and seed oils, particularly, I would say, in the context of fried food.
Okay.
So you want to avoid fried foods. But I believe that we should be avoiding these oils in general. And there's really not good data, I will admit, on the influence of these oils on our long-term brain health. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And what that means is that just because we don't have evidence of what these oils do to our long-term brain health doesn't mean that they are innocent.
Yeah.
Right?
That we should have a free-for-all.
Yeah. Our consumption of these oils has skyrocketed over the past century. They didn't exist in the human food supply prior to 80 years ago. And we know that the brain is made of fat. We know that the brain is made of polyunsaturated fatty acids primarily, right? DHA fat, docosahexaenoic acid, and omega-6 fats, right? Like arachidonic acid. And so polyunsaturated fats are essentially allowed free entry into the brain. They're easily able to cross the blood-brain barrier, which is this selective membrane that only allows certain things to enter into the brain, right? It's very protective of the brain because the brain is very delicate, it's very vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. Problem with grain and seed oils is that they are primarily comprised of these kinds of fats, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they're very prone to oxidation, a form of chemical damage that in whole foods, they are protected from that chemical process by the antioxidants that normally come in those foods, that you normally find in those foods, right? Whether it's vitamin E or various carotenoids that you see in different foods depending on the food. It's primarily vitamin E that protects against what's called lipid peroxidation. But degenerative brain diseases are characterized, at least in part, by rampant oxidative stress, and lipid peroxidation is a major problem. I mean, one of the reasons for this is that the brain is an organ, as I mentioned, comprised of these very delicate fats that utilize collectively as an organ 25% of your resting metabolic rate. 25% of the oxygen that you utilize is going to create energy in your brain, which is this organ that is isolated to a container the size of a grapefruit. So it's this very small mass, right? It's 2% of your body's mass, accounting for 25% of your body's oxygen utilization. And the organ in question is composed primarily of fats that are highly prone to oxidation, right? And also, we are in the context also matters, right? 90% of adults don't consume adequate vitamin E today, right? As I mentioned, 90% of adults are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. Vitamin E is one of these nutrients that you don't see a lot of overt, frank deficiency in the Western world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're consuming enough for our needs, particularly because we tend to consume so much of these grain and seed oils. And to me, it doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to assume that these oils are not doing are not doing our brain health any favors. Particularly because we consume so much. They're usually damaged because of the production process that it takes, the refining, the bleaching, the deodorization, and their trans fats are created in the production process that are further generated via frying, and we know that trans fat consumption is linked to worse memory function even among people who are young and healthy. We know that it puts you at higher risk for cardiovascular disease, for Alzheimer's disease. We see trace amounts of trans fats in these oils. So for me, it's like I love having data to cite. We don't have sort of long-term data on like really solid data on what these oils are doing to our brain health, but I think that they're definitely worth avoiding.
Do we know if there are long-term studies that are in the works now for grain and seed oils?
I don't actually know. I don't
Just
actually
curious.
know. I mean, depending on who you ask, they put you at greater risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, they do, compared to saturated fats, lower LDL. So in terms of the guidelines and what we see with regard to LDL and how LDL is associated with risk for cardiovascular disease, you might consume a lot of them and see your LDL come down, which might lead some to think that it's lowering your risk. And according to the evidence, it is. But we know that these oils, they're oxidation prone. They embed themselves into the lipoproteins that then end up in circulation that make them more prone to,
Right.
being sort of recognized by your immune system. It's just not, it's really, I think, smart to avoid them. And also, we know that extra virgin olive oil is the foundational oil of the Mediterranean diet,
Right.
adherence to which is associated with better brain health, better cardiovascular health.
Yeah, how I kind of look at it is not necessarily avoiding those oils, but why would I not want to include those olive oil, avocado oil that benefit me? So instead of like avoiding, it's like I want to use something that's benefiting me that we know is going to benefit me, and avocado, olive oil,
Yeah.
get the trick. So like why do you need those other oils?
Yeah. I mean, the dietary patterns that are most closely associated with better brain health, because this is a very new topic, right? The role of nutrition in brain health. 90% of what we know about Alzheimer's disease has been discovered only in the past 15 years or so, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really the MIND diet and the DASH diet are sort of the two with the most evidence. The DASH diet is a dietary approach to stop hypertension. That's what that acronym stands for. And then the MIND diet was developed by Martha Claire Morris at Rush University, and she passed away a couple of years ago, but I actually had the opportunity to interview her, and her diet is a sort of combination of the DASH diet and the Mediterranean dietary pattern. And the Mediterranean dietary pattern, the oil used is extra virgin olive oil. So for me, it's just a completely to advocate for grain and seed oil consumption for brain health makes zero sense.
Right.
Makes no sense whatsoever. And I actually think, I hope that within my lifetime we see like evidence to back up my hypothesis, but I don't believe that they're good for the brain.
Yeah. Let's figure out if anyone's doing studies, like long term, like is in the works. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would love to know.
There's homework for you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just get through the other foods that you want to avoid for cognitive health, because this is an important topic. You want to avoid alcohol. I'm definitely a recreational drinker. I drink occasionally, very occasionally, like 2 to 3 drinks a month, probably something like that. But we used to think that drinking in moderation was actually healthy. But we know that ethanol, which is the compound in alcohol, regardless of the spirit, is a neurotoxin. And there was actually a study, groundbreaking study published a couple of years ago in the BMJ, I believe, the British Medical Journal, that found that even moderate drinking, 5 to 7 drinks per week, was associated with 3 times the hippocampal atrophy as compared to non-drinkers. And the hippocampus is the memory center of the brain, and atrophy means shrinkage. So people who drank, even in moderation, had 3 times the atrophy in the vulnerable memory center of the brain, the hippocampus, as compared to non-drinkers. And usually moderate drinkers have better health, which is why this study was so shocking, right? When you're a moderate, but it's not, usually this research is observational. We don't know whether or not it's the alcohol that's creating this better health, right?
Yeah.
It's just associate. Correlation doesn't equal causation, right?
Correct.
Usually, I think in these studies, what it's showing is that people who are able to moderate their consumption of something, right? Like moderate people have better health than those who
go to extremes.
Yeah.
Moderate processed foods, moderate intake of sugar.
Yeah.
Moderate alcohol consumption.
Exactly.
Interesting. But the study showed that the hippocampus atrophied with moderate drinking.
Yeah.
Interesting.
With even moderate drinking.
Do we know how long the moderate drinking lasted?
And by the way, that study was observational as well.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, observational. So,
yeah.
But, that's what they found. They found that, but because there's healthy user bias there too, right? Yeah. So somebody who's not a drinker might be a more health conscious person than somebody who drinks even moderately, right? Like I'm a health conscious person. I don't drink 5 to 7 times per week. I drink like 3 times a month, maybe,
Yeah.
So I'm an example of like that healthy user bias.
Yeah. This is true.
So, but if you're able to drink in moderation, until we get more research, I would say just make sure that you're doing it, in a way that is as healthy as possible.
Right.
Meaning like you're hydrating, you're not letting it influence your sleep. You're picking spirits, and not adding a lot of like sugar and other stuff to those drinks. You're not letting the alcohol affect your food choices when you drink, which is one of the biggest problems with drinking is that it lowers inhibition.
Uh-huh.
It increases inhibition. It disinhibits you, right?
Yeah.
Or no, it lowers inhibition.
Yes.
Because normally we're inhibited from eating.
Taco Bell at 2 a.m.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what you were getting at,
yes,
right?
That's what I was getting at. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. You're more likely, this is observational, you're more likely to eat Taco Bell if you're intoxicated.
Yeah. And then finally closing out the last food. What is it? The 5th food? I wasn't counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, the 5th is actually not a food, but it's a dietary pattern.
Okay.
And this is going to trigger some people, but I would say veganism. So you want to avoid plant exclusive diets, because the best evidence that we have points to fish being medicine for the brain, wild fatty fish, right? Like wild salmon, sardines, herring, mackerel, things like that. We know that even egg yolks are a cognitive multivitamin. Yeah. So you should be eating fish, eating eggs. Choline. Eggs are one of the top sources of dietary choline. We've seen there was a study published in older adults showing that the highest choline consumers had it was either a 20 or 30% relative risk reduction for the development of dementia. And choline, you can find it in plants, but it's much more concentrated in animal products. And what they found was that the consumption of choline was associated with lower risk for dementia. I'm also a huge fan of grass-fed, grass-finished red meat for brain health. There's less evidence on that. I will concede, but I think it's a very nutrient-dense food. It's loaded with vitamin B12, vitamin zinc, nutrients that we know are great for the brain in their most bioavailable form. So, definitely want to avoid a diet that excludes all animal products. It's just not evidence-based. I mean, you can't have a conversation about brain food and not, neglect all the research that's showing us that fish is good for the brain.
Right, fish.
And other nutrients like choline, and preformed omega-3 fatty acids.
Right.
So important.
And I like that you phrased veganism as something, you didn't say plant-based, which I like, because you can be plant-based and still consume salmon here and there. Like there's nothing wrong with being plant-based, but still including those brain healthy fats
Yeah.
that are found in salmon and not found in a vegan diet.
100%. Somewhere along the line, somebody decided that plant-based, that the phrase plant-based should represent a plant-exclusive diet.
Yeah.
But that's
Plant
like
exclusive, that's what you said.
yeah. But that's like an aberration of grammar in the English language.
No, I agree.
You know?
Yeah.
Like
It's interesting.
we're carbon-based life forms,
Okay.
but we're not all carbon,
No.
right?
Yeah, I'd like to
There's-
think I'm plant-based, but do I eat grass-fed, grass-finished beef? Heck yeah.
Heck yeah, you do. So those are the foods
Okay.
to avoid for better brain health. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there. Sort of related is that coffee is rich in compounds called polyphenols, which are essentially plant defense chemicals, which also have a prebiotic effect. So polyphenols are loved by gut bacteria.